Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristen, and today I'm joined by SLP and dyslexia specialist Susan Danker to discuss the significant role that language plays in dyslexia. Hi, Susan. How are you?
I'm great, Tristen. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. This is a special episode. We have one of our co-owners here. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you and what you do.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Danker. I'm a co-owner and co-founder of the Reading and Language Learning Center, and I'm also the co-creator of the Sounds2Print multisensory reading program that we use at our clinics. And something that's really exciting is that our reading program was accredited recently by the International Dyslexia Association.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I'm a speech language pathologist, and I have over 26 years of experience working with children and teens, working on strengthening their communication, their reading, and their writing skills. I really love helping people see that speech language pathologists do so much more than just support communication. We actually get to help build literacy too.
Yeah, that's awesome. And such a special thing that we do here. So I'm glad we're getting to do this for Dyslexia Awareness Month.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you're looking to find out any more about Susan or us here at RLLC, then you can go to our website at readingllcenter.com. And if you're looking for us like physically in the world, we have 3 separate locations, one in Chantilly, Virginia, one in Vienna, Virginia, and one in Washington, D.C. So feel free to reach us in any of those clinics and, like I said, on our website. Well, all right, Susan, let's hop into these questions here.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah. All right. So first and foremost, let's do a definition of dyslexia so people get a good baseline for what we're talking about today.
Sure. That's a great question. Dyslexia currently is undergoing some changes in its definition. So, the International Dyslexia Association has a definition that is currently being used, and then one that should be forthcoming here soon. The big conference is coming at the end of October, so perhaps when I'm there, I'll get to find out what they've decided, if it's been decided at that point. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
But for right now, I'm going to start with how the International Dyslexia Association defines dyslexia. So I'm going to actually read this so I have it exactly how they say. So, dyslexia is defined as a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So it's a lot of words.
Yeah.
And, I think this is also why sometimes parents and teachers are like, they don't understand what dyslexia truly is when you have a definition that is trying to be really broad to encompass lots of things, but then it becomes a lot of words, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think if we think about it this way, some of the key takeaways are dyslexia is neurobiological. So that means it's a brain-based difference in how people are going to process sounds and written language. It's not about their intelligence or their motivation. It's really about how the brain is connecting the sounds and letters and meaning. So we often think about it when we hear dyslexia, the community as a general, they often think about it's just a reading problem. But actually, this starts much earlier. It starts back when we're learning to process spoken language. So it's really early on that we start to see signs of dyslexia, even in students as young as the preschool ages.
Wow. That is kind of crazy because, like you said, I do think most people, even like the general public, think of dyslexia as a reading issue. So Can you explain how the language processing plays a role in dyslexia, like you said, even as early as preschool
Mhm.
age?
Yeah. So when we break it all down, reading is really just like spoken language that's written down. So when a child struggles to recognize or play with the sounds or has trouble holding words in their mind and organizing them, that's going to make reading and spelling really hard. So dyslexia, it basically sits at a crossroads between that spoken and written language. So we want to keep in mind that dyslexia is language based. It's a language based learning difference. Both oral and written language skills are impacted, especially in that phonological processing. That's the way the sounds are going to be used in language. So all of that gets affected. And then students with dyslexia, they may also struggle with tasks that involve um, the spoken language, and it might show up as they have difficulty organizing sentences when they're trying to explain something about their day or describe an object. They might have trouble finding words to express their thoughts, and then that might leave the person they're communicating with trying to figure out, well, what are they saying? I don't really understand. So they're not able to convey the meaning or what they want to achieve in that conversation.
That is interesting. The ordering of a sentence can be affected by dyslexia. I don't feel like that's something people wouldn't think of.
Yeah, absolutely. And like sometimes I know students that I've worked with, parents will say, "Oh, it's so cute," when they're younger, and they'll say like guacagoli when they're talking about
Ah,
like guacamole. So
right.
that's a piece of where they're processing of the sounds, right? They've heard that word, it's a multisyllabic word, and then the sounds get mixed around in the word, but then that becomes part of that child's like vocabulary, and that's what they think that that word is.
Mm,
Yeah, definitely when the students are having trouble like finding the right word and they'll just say that thing, the thing. But then
yeah,
maybe their parent or their teacher doesn't know what the thing is that they're trying to
right.
describe.
Wow. That's so interesting. So you mentioned like especially the guacamole or something that
Hmm.
happens super early on. So what are other language-based warning signs that like a parent might notice to see that their child might be at risk for dyslexia?
Yeah. So a lot of times when I'm talking with parents, and I ask them to think back to preschool, think back to kindergarten, before reading truly begins. Like, then we want to talk about some of the things that they might have not noticed right then, but when I bring it to their attention, they might say, "Oh yeah, he or she did that. That's
Right.
crazy. I didn't know that." Could be a sign. But yeah, so we might spot these things before the kids become readers. And that might look like trouble learning the rhyming, if words rhyme or
Oh,
not, mixing up the order of sounds in words. So I kind of gave that example of the guacagoli. Um,
right.
and then another one was like bike-a-mo for a motorcycle. I've heard that
Oh,
happen before. So there's a lot of changing of the sounds in that word.
wow.
The student might have a smaller vocabulary or struggle to recall words that they already knew. If a student uses, like I said, the word thing or that stuff instead of the target word that they were trying to go for, that could be another sign. So, that word finding,
Right.
avoiding longer words altogether. Those are just some of the little red flags you might see. A sign that I find is often missed, not necessarily language based, but just whole body. When
Mm,
children don't crawl before walking, that can present a big problem because then the child is not crossing midline. So some
mm,
parents will say, "Oh no, he didn't even crawl. He just skipped right over that step. He pushed up and then he just started walking and running and never looked back." But it's
wow.
really an important piece that we want children to do that as they're growing and, moving and developing. We want that midline to be crossed.
And when you say midline, what does
Mm.
that mean?
Oh, that's a great question. So, midline, if we think about the two hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left hemisphere. So, we do want to have some crossing. And when we are crawling with all fours, we're using our arms and our legs. So we're sending the signals to both sides of the brain. When they look at like imaging of students with dyslexia, when we look at their brains, it often shows that the right hemisphere is very much lit up and
Mm,
the left hemisphere is not lit as much. Where in a student that is a reader and does not have dyslexia, the reading and language is taking place in the left hemisphere more prominently. So we want to help the kids get the information into the language centers and kind of do that piece of crossing midline and making
right,
sure that they're able to recall instead of just memorizing. They're putting it all into the right side and we can memorize, but only so far until
right,
that, you can't keep going with just
right.
memorization of words. Mhm.
Wow. Okay. Um, midline is such a interesting thing because I feel like once you know what it means, it is easy to comprehend. But it feels like a buzzword that you're like, I've never heard of that before. So thank you for
Yeah.
for going with us and explaining that. But what I've found really interesting in this discussion so far is like a lot of the things we're talking about are in oral language development, right? Like we haven't
Mhm.
even
For
talked
sure.
about the page yet. Um, so how does that oral language development, things like the vocabulary, like you mentioned,
Mhm.
syntax, or even like listening comprehension, influence a kid's ability to learn to actually read things off the page and to spell?
Mhm. Yeah. A strong oral language foundation is going to set the stage for reading and for writing ultimately. And vocabulary supports comprehension. So, when we've gotten the student, we've taught them how to decode the words and they're able to read now accurately. But if they're not extracting meaning, then we have to work in that language piece. We have to really develop that and help them understand like keywords that are in there and discussing the vocabulary words. A lot of times, students will read through a word and they might have pronounced it correctly, but then if I stop them and say, "Oh, remind me what that means," they might not have a proper definition of that vocabulary word that I might have thought, "Oh, they must know it because they decoded it." So that's really important. And then when we think about sentence structure, the sentence structure is going to support their writing. But when students are not able to identify parts of speech in a given sentence, they're not going to be able to have like varied sentence structures when they're talking or when they're writing. So, it's really important for the kids to know, putting a little bit more focus in the elementary school years on those parts of speech. What's a noun? What's a verb? What's an adverb? What's an adjective? The prepositions, so important, and conjunctions. Talking about those things and helping them. I know years and years ago they used to diagram sentences, and it was complicated for a lot of students, but I really see there's some value in, returning a little bit to teaching the kids how to diagram a sentence and pull out, show me where the noun is in this sentence. Great. So if we're going to add an adjective, the adjective is going to describe what. And kind of walking them through that to help them apply rather than just memorize that a noun is a person, place, or thing.
That's really interesting. I don't think I remember diagramming a sentence.
Yeah. So you might have just had to like, I mean, you can go really in depth with it, but a lot of times it would just be like colors. So you might find the noun and then mark between the noun and the verb, right? You
Mm,
maybe like circle the adjective in a certain color, find the
right.
prepositional phrase, and kind of just break the sentence up um,
Okay.
so that each part can be recognized then. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that does sound very helpful. Even like as
Mhm.
an adult, I'm thinking I learned those things
Yes.
and I like, I remember the parts of speech, but like
Sure.
if you asked me to do that right now, I'd probably say, okay, like I could kind of do it.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, it can be
um,
tricky because, like,
yeah,
some things have to be very explicitly taught to students too, right?
right.
Like, so we can have an adverb like here or soon or yesterday could even serve as an adverb, where a lot
Wow.
of times kids are taught that adverbs end in ly, which
Yeah.
most adverbs do end in ly, but there's other forms of adverbs. So that explicit teaching of that skill is so critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about phonological awareness? Maybe
Mhm.
define what that means, because I think
Sure.
people sometimes confuse it with phonics.
Mhm.
Um, and then why it's such a critical foundation for literacy.
Yeah. So phonological awareness is a really fun part of our therapy, but it's really just the ability to hear and manipulate sounds and words. If you think about it, phonological awareness is our foundation and it's our bridge into becoming a reader. So things like if a student can notice that in the word cat and cup, they both start with the same sound, right? So we can do like k for cat and k for cup. That's a good start. We
Right.
can do some of that kind of that rhyming, right? Do these two words rhyme if I say bat and cat? So we could say, yes, those rhyme. But if I say like bat and bug, do they rhyme? They might not be able to tease that out because they might be thinking, well, they both start with a b sound and not
Mm,
have that rhyming understanding. Another piece would be the blending. So if I gave the sounds like s, a, t, can they blend that into a word that they've heard, sat? And are they able to make that link from the sounds to the letters? With
right.
phonological awareness, it's really one of those clear predictors of that reading success.
Right.
So we really want that area to be strong because, like I said, it's going to predict if they're going to be successful in reading if they have this foundation nice and solid.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's again, I feel like it's so interesting to see all of these things that are more like almost sound based, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Like, I think for folks who have heard of dyslexia and, like we said earlier, think of it as a reading problem, you
Right.
don't realize um how much of reading is understanding the sounds that go with it. Because if you read something off a page, you don't have to make any sound to comprehend the word. Um, but like you talking about rhyming, and understanding that, what a C sound sounds like in relation to the rest of a word. I don't know, it's so interesting to me because it takes out the visual component that I think people sometimes think dyslexia is, right? Like they have a hard
Mhm.
time with their eyeballs. They think that the letters are backwards. Um, so anyway, I think that's just super interesting.
Yeah, it is, and, like, we want the kids to be able to manipulate the sounds too, so it could be, if I've said the word bat or I've showed them a picture of a bat, could be a baseball bat or the animal, and then if I say, "Okay, that says bat," change the first sound to "s." Are they able to manipulate that? This is without seeing any letters, just doing it auditorily. Can they make
Right.
those changes? And a reason that this is so important is because when we go to spell things, right, we can look
Mhm.
at word patterns, right? So if we have bat, sat, cat, all we're actually doing is changing that first sound. So when we can make that connection to this for the students, it's kind of like one of those aha moments. Oh, that's why we're doing this, right?
Right.
Um, so it really will help them with then decoding and the spelling. And also, we want them to hold these sounds in memory, right? Because
Yeah.
when we go to write a word, we have to remember all those pieces. Like we can do it really easily, you and I, but a student
Right.
with dyslexia, they have to think about all the parts, how to hold the pencil, how to form the letter, what was the sound, oh gosh, what came after that, and then maybe, oh, I forgot the word already, right? Because
Oof.
it's just a really long process for them. And typically students with dyslexia take twice as long to do something that a peer that does not have dyslexia can do it in.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, so I want to talk a bit about how to help these students other than like, why it's language based and what that looks like. I wanted to discuss like how speech language pathologists and reading specialists, or if they're one and the same, can work together to address both the language and literacy needs in children with dyslexia.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a lot of the reason why Carla and I started RLLC, right?
Yeah.
We are speech language pathologists, and we were noticing that students that we had worked with that had articulation issues or expressive and receptive language issues, as they got older, their parents were coming back and saying, oh, they're having trouble with reading now, or they're having trouble with written expression. Can you help? And it just kind of all snowballed right into, wow, we have this specialty of language and we have this training in literacy that, combining it, we get the best of both worlds.
Right.
So it's really great, and it's wonderful when the speech pathologist can co-treat or can, treat alongside with reading specialists. When they can team up, then the kids are getting coverage from both sides, right?
Right.
Speech pathologists can really dig into that language area and that
Right.
processing. And a lot of times it's just changing the way we're presenting the information. We don't want a cookie cutter program. We want to, if the student isn't getting it the way the book suggests that we teach it to them, how do we change the language so it makes sense for that child, right?
Yeah.
And then the literacy, of course, reading specialists often have a lot of training in the literacy piece. And that's really helpful too, especially working with the literacy specialists in the schools.
Yeah.
But I guess the SLP really, we are going to strengthen the foundation for sure.
Right.
And the literacy experts would be doing that too. But where the SLP would differ a bit is that we're the experts in speech sound production, right? So we know the order sound should develop in, and where the types of errors that students make, are they deleting, are they fronting sounds, different things like that when they're talking. Because if they're doing that when they're talking, it's going to make it so much harder to make that connection to the sound to the print.
Right.
We can help them with the sound processing, right? We can show them our mouth movement. We can use the mirror and model it for them so they can see, like, oh, I'm opening my mouth really wide when I say the sound ah. We really dig deep in that vocabulary. We help them with language organization, usage, and meaning. And the reading specialists, of course, they're going to build the decoding and the fluency. We do that as well, but reading specialists usually have particular goals on decoding and fluency. But together, everything clicks, right? When you get to collaborate and work to support a student. And then that student will ultimately reach the end goal of reading, which is comprehension.
Yeah. I have two follow-up questions from
Okay.
this for you.
Yeah.
One, I would love to touch on what we do here at RLLC because we're kind of a two-in-one specialty.
Right.
We're speech language pathologists who are reading specialists. So I'd love to
Mm-hmm.
talk about how SLPs can do both.
Mm-hmm.
But then I have another question for you, which is something you kind of touched on about articulation.
Mm-hmm.
I recently saw a writing sample from a kiddo that had dyslexia or has dyslexia, excuse me, and they tried to spell the word world,
Mm-hmm.
and it looked to me like they might have an issue with their R's because they spelled the word world as would or WOULD.
Mm.
Um, and I was curious if you think that is an articulation issue that's showing in print.
Mm, interesting. Okay, well, I'll start with your first question. So at RLLC, yes, so we are speech language pathologists, and then we have sat for our certification for to become structured literacy teachers, and then of course with the our program, the Sounds2Print program. With that accreditation, that allows us to now train even more SLPs and teachers and other people that want to understand dyslexia better and that really want to help children and give them that gift of reading. So it kind of really opens things up in that area. But
Yeah.
not all speech pathologists do dyslexia work, right?
Right.
And I know even back in graduate school, I remember, people saying, "Oh, you're wasting your time with that. It's not connected." And I was like, "No, it totally is connected, right? we have to have language. We have the sounds, we have the speech, right? We can look, even newborns, they're making communication with eye
Right.
gaze and smiling and giggling and crying, right? They're sending us
Right.
messages. So all of that communication, if that isn't happening, it's going to impact later on skills.
Right.
Yeah. And then your other question was about the students' writing that you saw. I know you said it was just writing you saw. You wouldn't know how old the child was by any chance?
Um, I think this is a middle school, like
Oh,
early middle school or late
okay.
elementary.
Mm-hmm. So you said they spelled the word world with WOULD instead of WORLD. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't necessarily think that in that writing, I wouldn't guess that it was articulation. I think that the student probably has tried to visually memorize, that there's some other letters in here, and I'm not sure how to do those patterns.
Mm,
If you think about earlier when I was saying how sometimes, it's going to take the students with dyslexia twice as long to do a task, right? So,
right.
because it was in a sentence, it wasn't just an isolated word that he was
Mm,
writing, that he probably kind of forgot what he was going with, or maybe would was going to be in that sentence.
right.
And then it ended up in that word instead of world. Um,
Right.
but yeah, the articulation errors, they'll show up in just random places. So it might be like in a word like, let's just say beam, and they might just throw an R in there. Like they might put like BEARM. And if you ask them, what does that say? They'll tell you beam. So it's just random that they'll just throw the letters in. And it's usually R's and L's that kind of linger around, even if those weren't their speech sounds that they had errors on when they were younger.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I don't know that there's any research on it, but it's just something that I've noticed over all these years that happens quite frequently.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, can you explain to a family why targeting that language first can really make a difference in how reading has how reading
Hmm.
turns out to be? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I actually just had a conversation like this with a parent. But I really like to tell parents that reading grows out of language. If a child doesn't understand what the words mean or how the sentences fit together, then the decoding piece, it's not going to stick, right? And then we're not going to be
Right.
able to comprehend it. So when we strengthen that language first, we're giving reading something solid to build onto.
Right.
Yeah. So, I can, sometimes parents will say, oh, well, they're able to read like 2 and 3 syllable words, which, okay, that's great that they've learned the decoding of those words, but do they have meaning and can they use that word in a sentence? So,
Right.
beyond just teaching students words, sometimes people do a lot of work with sight words, and that's great, but are they having the student use that sight word in a sentence, right?
Right.
And that's so critical because then it shows us, okay, they recognize this word now, and maybe they've done a mnemonic device to remember it because sight words are not words that we're going to be able to decode. Maybe like the word said, SAID, right? We can't
Mhm.
sound that out, but I can throw my own name in there. I can do Susan ate ice cream daily, and that can become a mnemonic to help the student remember that. They could draw a picture with it. But then we have to use it, right? And then we can talk about, oh, if I, use the word said, like Susan said, I could put a quotation, exactly what she said. So we can build that language right there and start showing them other ways to be creative in their writing.
Hmm. And so you said using a mnemonic device for sight
Mhm.
words, which means I think you said words that you can't decode, aka words you can't sound out, right?
Yeah, so true sight words are words that don't follow the rules at all of English. So if,
Oh,
like for the word said, if we were going to write it by the sounds that we hear s, eh, d. So most kids were going to write S and then the E and then a D. said,
Yeah.
right? So, and that's okay for that inventive spelling phase because kids are going to go through different phases of spelling. But then we want to do where we're going to change that. Yeah. So that those are the sounds in the word said. Now, let me show you how we convert that to the English word said.
Mm,
And doing that mnemonic, it's just a way to help with recall.
gotcha.
Yep.
Cool. So, what are some signs that tell you a kid isn't ready for formal decoding or like sounding out words, or reading intervention yet, and they still need to build stronger receptive and expressive language foundations first? If you want to
Mhm.
describe what receptive and expressive language is, that might also be
Yeah,
awesome.
sure. So, expressive language is going to be the output. So, talking and communicating that way, right?
Right.
And then the receptive is going to be understanding. So, that's going to be hearing information and following out, like if it's a command or somebody giving you directions. So we want to have both of those areas nice and strong. And sometimes children have a lot of difficulty with following directions. And I'm not just talking
Mm.
about children that are just being like oppositional or something like that, but truly they cannot follow the directions of like top, bottom, doing things like that. And when we're thinking about letters and letter formation and all of that, we do need to follow the directions, right? We need to know where the top is, where the bottom is, where left, where right is. So we're
Oh,
gonna
wow.
we're gonna focus on those pieces too.
Right.
Like some kids, you'll see them when they're little, even in preschool, and if you give them a book, some go from the front, like they've seen modeled for them by a parent or guardian, right, from the front to the back, and others start at the back and come to the front. So just really helping the kids kind of um, put those language pieces together, them being able to express some ideas and organize their thoughts. Um, that's really important too, because if I'm trying to teach them a concept and they're not getting it, but they're also not able to tell me like why or what's making this hard, right?
Right.
Then it makes it more difficult for me to figure out, okay, they're just shutting down, right? So I have to figure out how am I going to teach this concept by changing the language that I'm using for them.
Mm.
But the vocabulary again too. We really want that vocabulary to be growing, and in order to the even the phonological awareness that we talked about, right? Following the direction of we're going to change the first sound, we're going to change the last sound, or what's the
Mm.
sound in the middle, right? Being able to isolate sounds and segment, it's all part of language. So
Wow.
we want to make sure that the language is strong enough to support then moving into the learning how to read. And ultimately, the ultimate goal is when we're reading, is to comprehend what we read. Yeah.
Wow. That is so crazy because you don't even think about the fact that someone has to understand what you're saying to be able to
Hmm.
understand to learn.
Right.
So the receptive and expressive language piece, I mean, super, super interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so can focusing on oral language skills early actually make later reading intervention more effective?
Yeah. So if a child can't yet hear or play with the sounds in words and struggles to retell like simple stories or has trouble understanding basic vocabulary, they might need more time building that spoken language before diving into that decoding. But it's not about delaying it necessarily. It's more about are they ready to do it?
Yeah. Okay. So how do you explain the sequencing to parents? Like if, language before learning to read, especially if those parents are really anxious to start literacy support like right
Mhm.
away.
Yeah. So I think like once parents get a diagnosis of dyslexia, they want to jump straight into how do we sign up and how do we do reading lessons? And I get
Right.
that, right? Everybody wants to fix something, and
Right.
unfortunately, there is no magic wand to fix dyslexia, but we can give tools to the children.
Right.
But just jumping straight in, that's not going to take away the root of the problem. So, I tell them about it's kind of like the language, if you think about it, is like the soil that reading's going to grow in. So, if we
Mm,
plant it too soon, it's not going to take to root. And then we're just left with whatever grows. That's it. But if we
yeah.
strengthen that language first, we're not slowing things down, but we're making sure that we don't have to redo our teachings later.
Right.
And like sometimes we can do some of the pieces that are related to, decoding and spelling um, in tandem with the language. It's not always a first and then. Sometimes they
Mm,
can be done simultaneously. It really just depends on the student, it depends on their age. And, a lot of times students have multiple diagnoses when they come. So
right.
really, we have to look at everything, and each child is going to have something a little bit different. And every child that we work with, we tailor their therapy to their particular needs, not just, oh, everybody's got to do this. But
Right.
phonemic awareness and the phonological processing, it should be part of every lesson we do. It's just that some
Right.
students need more explicit time in those phases before moving on into
Right.
a true decoding and going for reading in context and stuff like that. We have to do things very systematically to get them where they're going to thrive.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I feel like the reading in context piece, um, even I have heard like some parents say like my kid's just reading like one word at a time. Like why does
Mhm.
it feel like it's moving so slowly? But
Yes.
like you said, it's really building that foundation so that they have something to stand on when they finally get to reading in context.
Mhm.
And I think that piece doesn't always like get to parents.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, my last question for you is for the parents and the professionals listening, what's one thing you wish that everyone understood about the language side of dyslexia?
It's a really great question. I think that, dyslexia isn't just a reading issue, it's language at its core. And when we focus on language, we're not just teaching kids to read words, we're helping
Right.
them connect the sounds, the print, and meaning so that reading becomes communication and not just decoding. So I think that a lot of times the language piece gets overlooked. And, a lot of times parents will say, well, I don't know why we have to do that part. But it's just so, so important that it is all connected. Dyslexia is a language based learning difference. And a big piece of that language is what speech pathologists do and what we get to do at RLLC.
Well, that is amazing and I think very helpful. This has been such a great conversation. And I think very eye-opening to parents. So I hope that everyone listening gets, to take a few tidbits out of this. I got a lot out of this.
Fantastic. Love hearing
Yeah.
that.
Well, thank you for being with us, Susan.
Thanks, Tristen.
Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.